So what's the phrase? Something like, you cannot kill that which has no life. No, I think that's South Park. Lovecraft is something like, you cannot kill that which eternally lies. In any case, the point is that the hideous abomination known as the alternate interpretation of silver has crawled back from the abyss from whence it has been lying, with a new video purporting to explain something. Now, not that we see any actual fighting or, God forbid, a sword. Instead, we get interpretive shadow puppetry against a wall. And something that's very close to an admission that it doesn't work. But the argument seems to be that if you make an attack from wide distance, stepping in with a foot in the normal way, you'll never hit anybody because it's far too slow, and the other person can do something to defend themselves, and somehow that makes it false, and by which I think they mean bad. Okay, so let's start with having a look at whether any of that is true. Can you hit somebody on a simple direct attack stepping in with a foot, or is it impossible? So according to the alternate theory, all that's impossible. That can never happen. But obviously, yes, it can. If you can't hit somebody with a direct attack, stepping in with your foot, then you're doing it wrong, people. Okay? Now, that said, obviously the defender can do something about it. Silver says so, and he says he's quite specific. He gives us 3 different ways in which the defender can defend themselves. The first one of these is to strike or thrust at him as he gains you the place by his coming in. In other words, what we will call a counter-attack. I like to subdivide this into 2 different sorts of counter-attacks. The counter-attack with opposition, where you parry the blow with your sword while simultaneously hitting them. And the counter-attack without opposition, where you stay out of distance and strike at the extended target. So let's look at the first one, the counter-attack with opposition. How does that work?
So this is just textbook Silver. This is what he means when he says, if you try and strike somebody on the head, you will surely be striking yourself. All that happens is Josh launches his attack, moving his hand first. I do a little triangle step around to the right, away from the blow, and counter strike to the head, simultaneously parrying his sword with my forte. And it cuts down his face and into his shoulder in this case. There are, of course, lots of other ways of making counterattacks in various broadsword traditions. Here's a few.
Now, the counterattack without opposition. That's where you're slipping back, staying out of range of the sword, and counterattacking to the extended target, which is obviously going to be the sword arm. Let's have a look at one of those.
So here I'm provoking Miles by delivering a thrust, encouraging him to parry and riposte, and then I slip back to avoid his riposte and countercut over the top onto his arm, and that's my counterattack. In this example, Grizzly has a sort of fancy flourish in the middle of his riposte, and Miles very sensibly doesn't worry about parrying that, simply steps back out of distance and takes Grizzly's arm off.
Now, the second way you can defend yourself is to cross and then to uncross. In other words, to parry and return or riposte. And that's pretty straightforward. If you don't know what a parry and riposte is by now, you're in the wrong place. And our third option is to slip back a little and strike or thrust after him, which is just generically in later British sources known as the slip. So let's have a look at how you make a slip.
Boom, boom. So here's a slip. So what happens here is Miles develops his attack. Grizzly just slips back or leans back to avoid that. And as Miles's sword swings through, Grizzly comes in over the top and hits him before he can get away. Here's a slip to an outside cut. A slip to an inside cut. And a slip in the middle of a sequence, which is a reminder that all these techniques don't just happen in isolation. They go against from a sort of standing start against a direct attack. You can use them in the middle of the more complex sequences.
So yes, the defender does have time to do any of those 3/4 things. They can defend themselves in time. Okay? But the whole point of the true times, like this is the whole point, is that from the attacker's point of view, that's not a disaster. Just because they're attempting to defend themselves does not mean that you're going to die. You can do something about every single one of those things. Okay? And that is the whole point of Silver dividing up the action between the different speeds in which parts of the body move. That's the whole point of the true times. Okay? So let's start with the counterattack. How do you defend yourself against a counterattack?
Now, most of the time, that doesn't happen. Most of the time, this was what happened. You attempt a countercut and the other person's sword gets in the way and they just crash together and nobody gets hit. And that's what Silver means in Paradox 7 when he talks about how two skillful men can never cut just together. The reason is that if you're attacking in the true times, your hand has the freedom to change angles on the way in to deal with the counterattack. So here, Josh starts his attack, and I'm attempting to come in with a reverse cut around the outside of the sword. Now Josh sees that and turns his hand from angle to the inside to be angled to the outside, and he intercepts my countercut, and swords clash and nothing happens. In this case, I'm the one attacking. I start with a reverse cut. Josh attempts to countercut up into my arm from underneath. And again, I see that coming and I turn my point down to intercept his countercut. In other words, I'm redirecting my sword halfway through my action in order to deal with what the other person is doing. And I can do that because my hand is moving before my feet. In this one, Josh is attempting to stop thrust to my face. And again, I'm starting my attack. I see the point coming forward, so I redirect my sword to slap the thrust away and then attempt to hit Josh. In this case, he managed to get the sword back to avoid it, but I'm not dead. I have redirected my sword into his counterattack and defeated it. But of course, sometimes it is possible to hit the person doing the counterattack. So in this case, I'm starting the attack, moving my hand first. Josh starts his counterattack to my head, and I see it, and I turn my sword ever so slightly from the inside line to the outside line, catch his foible on my forte, which allows me to just cut through and hit him. Here, Josh tries a counter thrust again, and again, because my hand is moving first, I can slap it away. This time, I hit it a bit harder. Josh rightly takes that energy and rolls it around for a second attack, and I recover my sword in order to intercept his redoublement, which leaves me in close distance, and I can strike him in time of the hand before he can get away. So if you are attacking in true time, that is, you are starting in wide distance and moving your hand before your feet, your hand has freedom of action. And if somebody attempts to counterattack at you, you can change the angle of your sword in order to deal with it. And you can use that to intercept their counterattack and hit them on the arm, or even close in and kill them. Now, that's not to say that the counterattack isn't useful. It is particularly useful, especially against people who attack in false times, which is what silver says. For example, that and that.
So the next defensive option you've got, of course, is the parry. So how do the true times overcome the parry? There are essentially two options. Now, the first one of these involves what is infamously known as the slow hand. Okay, now, yes, okay, it is mentioned in silver in the weird bit at the back. There's one line, in the bit that we're not even sure silver actually wrote. I don't mind it as a phrase, but it seems to upset people. So I'm going to offer an alternative. Let's call it the free hand, because silver talks about the freedom of the hand having freedom of movement. And in a way, that's a better description of what's going on. And so let's look really clearly at how you do this, which I've been told is impossible. You can't possibly do any of this in real fighting. But let's have a look at how you actually use the freedom of your hand to defeat a parry, and what we generally call the redirection.
For example, here I start to develop an inside card. Josh starts to turn his sword up into a hanging guard, and so I turn my wrist to redirect the sword from the inside to the outside line, and Josh is unable to get his sword back up into an outside guard in time, which incidentally is why silver says don't do it. This is a mirror image. I start with a cut to the outside line, drawing an outside parry. I see that it's way too wide, and so I turn back to the inside, and Josh is unable to get his sword back in time. Now, these techniques don't just have to be used from a standing start. You can also use them in the middle of an exchange. So here, Bruce Lee throws an attack, intercepts Andrew's return, starts another attack, sees that Andrew is already in an outside guard, and so halfway through he redirects his sword from the outside to the inside in order to avoid Andrew's parry and hit him, and Andrew does not have time for a second parry. Here, after a bit of back and forth, Josh starts a downright throw. I extend my sword out too far into what silver would call an imperfect guard, not a good hanging guard at all, and Josh sees that and redirects underneath it into a sort of cut three up into my chest and body. And here, he does it again. Now, one good argument for using the term the free hand as opposed to the slow hand is that sometimes you redirect the sword by going faster, not slower. So here, Josh doesn't attempt to countercut at me at all. He actually starts swinging at my sword. Now, I see that quite early, and I speed my hand up rather than slow it down to avoid that and then swing around and hit him on the head. Now, countercutting at your opponent's sword from open like that is effectively parrying forehand from open, which is something silver says specifically don't do it, and that's why. Here's another one straight out of the book, Brief Instructions, Chapter 8.10, if you would like to look it up, where basically I'm delivering an imbricata thrust, which is in a hanging guard position, so therefore part of garden fight, forming in this case, Josh parries gardant, which means he has to drop his sword down to do it, which allows me to redirect my sword over the top and hit him on the head. And as I say, this is exactly how silver describes it in Brief Instructions. Now, whether you want to call that a redirection or a redoublement, or as silver does, safely coming to the half sword, is up to you. But that's how it works. Now, lest you think that the existence of redirections means that you can't defend yourself from an attack, no, absolutely not. The reason why silver tells us to do defenses in the specific way he does is so that they counter the redirections, okay? So when silver tells us to move in a certain direction and do certain things with our sword and not do certain things with our sword, it's all so that we can make a second parry against unexpected events such as a redirection. So here Josh is attempting the same redirection, transitioning into a cut 3 underneath my gun that he's already hit me with twice before in this clip. This time, however, because I haven't extended my sword too far, I can roll my sword over into a forehand board and avoid his redirection. So they're not impossible to defeat. The whole point of Silver's defenses is that you can. Now, I also want to make the point that these redirections are not feints or falses or false play. Okay? So what you're seeing here, this is a feint, this is a false. Okay, I throw a cut 4, which is never intended to hit Miles, it's just intended to draw the outside half hanger, and Miles obliges, and then I reverse and throw the real cut onto his head. And this is false play. This is a deliberate feint designed with a plan in mind. This, however, is an ad hoc redirection, and honestly, I have no idea why I did this. Okay, I start a reverse cut, and then roll it all the way around into a cut 4 into Josh's left hand while protecting myself underneath my hanging guard. And I don't know why I did that. My lizard brain must have just seen an opportunity to hit a target that was not the one that I was intending to when I started, and it just responded. And in this case, this very unconventional redirection worked quite well, but it was not in any way a plan.
So the second way of defeating parry is using what we call the recovery. Now, one of the tricks for recovering against a parry is, of course, that you've got to be faster than the riposte. And this is where the freedom of the hand comes into it, because you make a committed attack and you do nothing when the other person parries to prepare yourself, then they will probably hit you with their riposte. If, however, you see that they are going to parry you and you speed up your action using the freedom of the hand and start your recovery, then you can defeat the parry. So let's have a look at how you use the recovery.
So these are all pretty straightforward. In every case, the attacker, rather than flying out upon their ward, stays in upon their ward. In other words, they recover their sword into a ward to intercept the riposte, but actually stay in at what's called the half sword and launch a second attack. Now, to successfully recover, you really need to know that you're doing it beforehand. You've got to know that your opponent is going to parry and riposte. So you're really starting your recovery before your blow has really landed. And in this last one, Josh throws a little redirection into his riposte as well. He ripostes high, drawing an outside parry, then cuts low and hits me underneath the sword again.
So the third defensive option is the slip. So how do you survive as somebody who slips your blow? So essentially you do the same thing as you would against a parry. That is, you recover your sword so that they don't hit you. And here I think you can see that the subtlety of the timing really well, in that you are not just swinging through blindly and letting them come in behind you and hit you. You see that they're going to slip. You use the freedom of your hand to redirect your sword from an attack into a recovery to intercept the slip. So let's have a look at how that works.
Here I throw a downright blow and Josh slips back, so I realise I'm not going to reach him. I realise he's trying to slip it. And rather than just swinging through, I pull my sword back into a low outside spadroon, outside hanger, right arm protect, whatever you want to call that guard, in order to intercept his inevitable riposte. If I'd swung through, Josh would have hit me, but I use the freedom of my hand to recover so that I can avoid that fate. Here's the same thing happening again, and the thing to note here is that this is using exactly the same subtle redirection of your sword as you would do if you were recovering. If Josh had parried that instead of slipping it, I would have been doing the same slowing down and redirecting and pulling back into a recovery before the riposte, as I'm doing against the slip. And again, I'd like to make the point that these principles apply within the context of an exchange of blows as well as just from a standing start. Here in the middle of this sort of little flurry of blows, Parry attempts to, or successfully slips Josh's riposte. Josh sees that Parry is going to slip and countercut, so he aborts his riposte and recovers into a guard to protect himself. And of course, just like recovering against the parry while staying in distance, if you can recover against a slip, you don't need to fly out. You can intercept the riposte and get the second attack, which is what I just did to Josh there and there.
Now, once you can do all that, and you can do it from both a standing start as an initial defense and within the context of an exchange, then you get to, good fencing, okay? So Silver talks ever so briefly about fighting at the half sword and about that being the place where your skill really comes out. So what does he mean about fighting at the half sword? Well, he's just talking about having multiple exchanges, all of which can involve direct attacks, redirections, counterattacks, parries, slips, redirections of the sword to counter the counterattacks, parries, and slips. And if you're both perfect on that, nobody will get hit. Now, of course, nobody is perfect all the time, and Silver says staying in close distance and doing these sorts of exchanges can be dangerous. But it can also be fun, and it is a good test of your skill into how much you can do that and get away with it and step out and survive. So I thought we'd finish the video with just a few exchanges at what Silver would be calling fighting at the half sword, so you can see how this plays out. So there we have it. That is how you use the true times to both make an attack safely and defend yourself from any sort of defense your opponent can make. Okay, that's the whole point of the true times. It's the whole point, is that you have freedom in your hand to respond to what the defender does. You might not hit them, but at least you'll stop them hitting you. Okay, which is obviously the more important bit. And that's, like I said, that's the whole point of the true times, is that you can do that. And that's how it's done. And if that was not true, then nobody would ever attack. Okay? And Silver says quite specifically that the advantage does not lie in the attacker or the defender. It lies in the person who obeys the true times. So if it was not true that you could attack and protect yourself from whatever response the defender does, you would not attack, and that is not what Silver says. So, I hope you have enjoyed that, and I hope it has been enlightening. Cheers.